The Soviet T-34-85 is universally recognized as the mechanical engine of Allied victory on the Eastern Front. This chart shows 1944 combat readiness. While other units broke down, the T-34-85 maintained an 80 to 90% availability. But this reliability masked a fatal reality. If hit, crews had exactly 9 seconds to evacuate. 9 seconds before the tightly packed ammunition ignited, causing a catastrophic internal cook-off. This narrow survival window strips away the myth of a perfect tank. The interior was physically punishing and inherently dangerous to the men tasked with operating it. The T-34-85 is a masterclass in architectural pragmatism. Soviet designers intentionally traded crew survivability and localized tactical superiority to achieve absolute industrial scalability. To understand why they made that trade, we must look at the Soviet interwar military doctrine, known as deep operations. Instead of slow positional battles, the Red Army prioritized rapid, deep penetration strikes. Mikhail Koshkin and his engineering team at Kharkiv Plant No. 183 designed the T-34 lineage to execute exactly this type of warfare, building on a series of fast tank prototypes like the BT-7M. These early designs served as critical testbeds, proving that engineers could successfully combine sloped armor geometry with high-torque diesel engines. When the German invasion began in 1941, early T-34 models outclassed their rivals. Yet extreme industrial disruption forced immediate compromises. Critical diesel engine shortages meant factories had to equip early vehicles with highly unreliable gasoline engines. As the conflict evolved, the State Defense Committee issued a strict directive: upgrade the tank to match modern threats, but do not allow the assembly lines to stop producing. Evaluating the T-34-85 means looking at a rigid systems engineering problem. Every single increase in firepower or armor had to be paid for with a spatial or ergonomic compromise. By the summer of 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, the original T-34-76 finally met its match. The standard 76.2mm rounds were completely incapable of penetrating the heavy frontal plates of newly introduced German Panther and Tiger tanks at typical combat distances. Engineers briefly tested a high-velocity 57mm gun, but its small, high-explosive yield proved entirely inadequate against soft targets like infantry and anti-tank guns. The State Defense Committee issued Decree 5020SS, mandating an immediate transition to a larger multi-purpose 85mm caliber derived from a proven anti-aircraft gun. This schematic illustrates the necessary evolutionary compromise. To fit the massive new weapon system, engineers widened the physical bottleneck, expanding the original turret ring out to a 1600mm diameter. Pushing the ring out created enough internal volume to finally accommodate a 3-man turret layout. Adding a dedicated gunner transferred aiming duties away from the tank commander, leaving him free to actually scan the battlefield and coordinate tactical movements. Modifying the existing ring was the only pragmatic method to solve the firepower deficit without halting production to design a completely new hull chassis from scratch. The new ZIS S-53 weapon system delivered a substantial increase in lethality. Looking at this data plot of the standard BR-365A armor-piercing round, we can trace the ballistic drop-off. At 500 meters, the shell retained enough kinetic energy to punch through 124mm of solid steel. Even with this upgrade, the round still struggled against the thick, heavily sloped frontal armor of German heavy tanks. To survive, Soviet crews adopted highly aggressive flanking maneuvers, closing the distance to 800 meters to target the weaker side armor of Panthers and Tigers. Engineers also made a highly deliberate choice regarding the ammunition. They matched the ballistic flight path of the high-explosive rounds to be nearly identical to the armor-piercing rounds. This allowed the gunner to use the exact same markings on the TSH-16 telescopic sight, whether engaging heavy armor or a dug-in infantry position. Operational manuals dictated rigid mathematical lead calculations. If an enemy vehicle was moving at 15 kilometers per hour at 800 meters, the gunner was instructed to place the reticle exactly on the leading edge of the target. Standardizing the ballistics and optics minimized cognitive load. drastically simplifying fire control for hastily trained conscripts operating under extreme combat stress. This X-ray reveals the cost of that firepower. Lacking a rotating turret basket left the floor layout and exposed ammunition boxes static. The loader and gunner had nowhere else to stand. They were forced to balance directly on top of the secondary ammunition bins. Inside this cramped space, the loader physically wrestled with 16-kilogram shells, pulling them from the primary rack to sustain a maximum fire rate of roughly 4 rounds per minute. Whenever the turret rotated, the crew executed a dangerous shuffle. They had to step over open floor hatches while dodging the heavy swinging gun breech and the scalding brass casings ejecting into the cabin. The situation worsened when the tank entered combat and the hatches were locked down, plunging the crew into severe tactical blindness. Most of the crew relied on single, narrow vision slits at visual acuity. This created a critical tactical vulnerability. Enemy infantry could walk within 20 meters of the hull completely undetected. Because of this blind spot, the commander was strictly instructed to drop all other tasks and focus entirely on visual scanning to protect the vehicle from close-range ambushes. Integrating the 85mm gun into an aging hull required a direct sacrifice of interior survivability, spatial awareness, and basic human ergonomics. Piloting the front-heavy machine required immense physical exertion. The driver relied on heavy steering levers and stiff mechanical brakes, managing the transmission without the benefit of synchromesh gears. This schematic of the drivetrain highlights the dry multi-plate clutch. It was a strict maintenance hazard that required crews to manually adjust the clearance to an exact 6 to 7 millimeters every 10 hours of operation, or the plates would slip under load. Mastering these brutal controls offered a massive tactical payoff. The V2 diesel engine generated 2,200 newton-meters of torque, allowing the driver to aggressively launch the heavy vehicle from a complete dead stop directly into second gear. Paired with wide waffle tracks that reduced ground pressure, the vehicle possessed exceptional off-road agility, easily churning through mud and snapping trees up to 80 centimeters thick. That rugged cross-country mobility allowed armored columns to bypass defensive strongpoints and strike the strategic rear, fulfilling the central functional requirement of deep operations. While German Panther battalions often sat at a dismal 35% combat readiness due to complex, failing drivetrains, the Soviet tank columns reliably maintained an 80 to 90% operational rate. The ultimate proof of this concept occurred during Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. Fast-moving Soviet columns exploited breaches in the line to encircle and entirely shatter the German center in Belarusia. The Soviet experience demonstrated that a mechanically simple tank reaching the front lines decides the outcome of a campaign far more effectively than a technologically superior vehicle stuck behind the lines with a broken drivetrain. Sustaining that aggressive momentum across an entire continent demanded an unbreakable industrial supply chain. The logistical lifeblood came from the Trans-Caucasus region. Refineries in Baku supplied nearly 90% of all Soviet gasoline, alongside the critical B-78 high-octane fuels required to keep the diesel engines running in extreme cold. Meanwhile, at the evacuated Ural Tank Factory No. 183, engineers pioneered rapid manufacturing shortcuts, drastically reducing assembly time through the use of automatic submerged arc welding. This frantic pace produced massive variations in quality. Early production models often suffered from brittle armor plates and misaligned gearboxes, while late-war assemblies proved highly reliable. But these shortcuts cut the labor required per unit by half, enabling the Soviet Union to assemble over 80,000 T-34 variants. That sheer volume completely negated any localized individual advantages possessed by German heavy armor. But T-34-85 functioned as a heavily mobilized industrial weapon system, optimized for maximum manufacturing output over individual mechanical perfection. Following the collapse of Nazi Germany, the tank transitioned from a wartime emergency build into one of the most widely exported combat vehicles of the Cold War. This blueprint comparison shows the standardized Model 1969 upgrades, which modernized the chassis by integrating pressed steel Starfish wheels and dual 200-liter rear external fuel drums. It added an active infrared headlight on the left glacis, extending its operational life into modern night combat environments. Post-war Western intelligence agencies often evaluated the vehicle poorly, criticizing components like its multi-cyclone air filters and transmission as outdated. yet actual field testing proved otherwise. The Finnish military extensively tested captured models and found that the V2 diesel engine was exceptionally reliable in sub-zero winter temperatures, consuming far less oil than contemporary designs. Those wide tracks and the high-torque diesel propulsion allowed it to easily traverse harsh, muddy, and snow-filled terrains that paralyzed other vehicles. The legacy of the T-34-85 proves that in large-scale conflicts of industrial attrition, mechanical simplicity, logistical scalability, and architectural pragmatism will always triumph over over-engineered tactical perfection.